Hello everyone and welcome. Sit back, relax, make a cup of tea or whatever you like to drink and get ready for new stories from Yellowcat. Send your own favorite stories in the comments below and maybe they'll be in our new video. So subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed yet. Let's get started. What was the last straw for you to quit without giving an explanation? I worked as a bar manager at a restaurant where the general manager had never run a restaurant before but was the son of a close friend of the owner. As a result, I was essentially working as his assistant in the kitchen while the kitchen manager watched Netflix in the back office. You know what? We don't really care about that part of it. It was better than if he had tried to wing it, because then we would have to do the same work and clean up any mess he made. However, he was incredibly insecure about it, and he frequently found ways to undermine and otherwise screw with us as a result. The worst part for me was when he discovered he could control who could work what jobs by using priority controls to assign and revoke the credentials individuals would use to clock in. Whenever I train my bartenders, he uses this to repeatedly revoke their credentials, forcing them to work as bussers until they finally say F this and quit. Over the course of the last 5 months that I worked there, I was forced to work alone without a bar back in a 30-seat bar and a 30-seat restaurant. He was extremely ill-suited for one specific server, more on that later, who could command him to do anything she asked. He ended up rewriting all of the FOH schedules to give her the largest section for every weekend shift for several months as a result of this arrangement. That would have infuriated every other server on its own, but to make matters worse, she would F over the other half of those and no-show for about half of them. Despite this, she never lost her positions, no matter how unpleasant it made things on the days she failed to show up. This hit critical mass one day where 2 servers who had the evening off found her absolutely hammered at a different bar on a Saturday night where she was supposed to be working, and it came out that she usually missed those shifts because she just didn't feel like working that night, even though she had specifically asked for those shifts and would out partying instead. After an ugly altercation, the general manager dismissed the 2 servers who had argued with her the day before due to poor turnover time. This infuriated the other servers, who brought the matter up with the owner. After 2 weeks with nothing happening, the general manager essentially fired every server and closed the restaurant for a week in order to hire new staff. I went out for drinks with the kitchen manager that evening, and we made the decision to quit because we were tired of his nonsense. Because he had been revoking their bartending privileges, I didn't have any bartenders under me at that point, but the rest of the kitchen walked out within the chef. They ended up closing down for over a month and only limped along for another couple of months after reopening before the owner decided to take them out behind the shed and cut his losses. The last I heard about him, the owner was being taken to small claims court by his new kitchen because he didn't pay for the second month and didn't tell anyone he was closing it until they showed up to a locked door and a sign. 1. Finding out that my boss was paying the law firm's bills with money from clients, stamp duty payable to HMRC on property purchased UK, he had talked about before working together with a French law firm, maybe moving the practice to France and other things. That's all it would take for him to disappear. If his clients ever wanted to sell their homes, they would have to pay the stamp duty to the HMRC on their own. Stamp duty isn't always a small amount. I called in sick, told the Law Society about him, and then quit after they began their investigation. After 5 months, he was fired for misusing client funds. Ex-boss now sells insurance for yachts. 2. A company that makes shady resin driveways. I had to lie to Trading Standards when my boss told me they're coming tomorrow. He remembered that I had told him that Trading Standards were going to look into him because the person who was hired as a Trading Standard officer told me that. Google said I visited the company and the TSO told me not to use them. That the visit was going to work in the office of was not something I told the TSO. At that time, I also told my boss I would leave if and when the TSO showed up. Didn't go back. That business shut down. I spent some time working in a call center. In essence, I answered calls from customers and completed tasks for a technician who had been sent out to troubleshoot or perform new installations. I didn't detest my work. Time actually flew by when things were busy. I consistently won the leaderboards for the most closed-out calls. with an extra $100, which is significant when your hourly wage is only $10. The outage was the issue. We'd have hours in the morning or late at night with nothing to do. However, the PCs in front of us were connected to the internet and we frequently visited forums. The big boss, who none of us ever saw because he was rarely there, entered the room one day and began yelling at a young woman about misusing company property without any prior warning. Because she was expecting, she had been on a forum for young mothers or something. Before allowing her to go, he immediately fired her and chastised her for a good 5 minutes. The remaining 12 or so of us in the room were then addressed by him. He let out a deafening scream, warning us that this is what happens when we use company computers for purposes other than work. We were also instructed not to discuss anything outside of work-related topics with one another. I finished my shift. It was miserable. Just sitting there with absolutely nothing to do. My last day before the weekend was that one. I took Monday off due to illness. I simply didn't bother calling on Tuesday, and I never did. It was mind-bogglingly horrible. No way could I work a 12-hour shift like that again. I learned years later that the owner had filed for bankruptcy and the company had closed. As the shift lead, I worked in a kitchen where the management was completely unaware of BOH. During every peak shift, I operated the grill, sauté, expo, and ovens by myself. I scheduled kitchen cleaning projects, ordered trucks, prepared all week for the weekend brunch, called vendors for repairs, and oversaw the day-to-day operations of the kitchen. After receiving the keys, I began operating 6 days a week. I was enjoying working more than 50 hours a week. In an effort to reduce waste and utilize leftover brunch food, I created an early week menu and extended our brunch service to Fridays in addition to Saturdays and Sundays. In 3 years, I contributed to the weekly sales growth from 40 to 45K to 75 to 80K. Closing management became problematic for me during shifts when I wasn't present. When I arrived at the restaurant at 6 a.m. to open, it was disorganized and there was unfinished prep and stocking. I attempted to get assistance from the staff by having conversations with them, but I received no backing or action from the managers themselves. This continued for several weeks. One week, I arrived at 5 p.m. to prepare for Friday brunch. While preparing bacon sheets, I went to the rear to retrieve the biscuits that I had prepared the previous day. They were sitting atop a speed rack. I discovered them piled on top of one another on a shelf. Every biscuit had been crushed into individual dough sheets on the lower trays by the weight of the trays. The dressing and cold items from the line closure the previous evening were stored in the speed rack. The opening manager arrived at 8:30, and by the time we opened at 9, I had finished about 90% of the brunch prep. What was left to set up the line, I told her. Why was I telling her, she inquired. I placed the dough sheets in front of her, set my keys on top, and turned to leave. They sent me dozens of texts that day, in addition to almost 50 calls. I didn't reply to any of them. A few days later, I received a call from the store owner asking who he needed to fire in order to get me back. I assured him I would succeed, and within a day I secured another job. This restaurant closed down and was demolished to make way for a parking garage a little more than a year later. What HOA rules have been the most stupid/outrageous? How'd you deal with it? In their neighborhood, my boyfriend's parents aren't allowed to have any fences. There's a nice resort neighborhood on top of a ski hill and golf course, but no one uses their beautiful backyards because they aren't private. They live on a corner lot and bought/grew enormous 6-foot-tall shrubs so nobody can see into their backyard from the street, but their neighbors, no shrubs there, or it gets into a debate about property lines, can all still see into their yard. Also, both their front and backyards are very big. This summer, they manicured it every weekend. When he lived with us, my boyfriend had to mow the lawn at least once a week or the neighbors would talk about him. Our new townhouse is in a complex with about 30 units. There's an HOA that takes care of things like trash, snow removal, etc. We want to sell our house after 2 years, and the buyer's inspector only finds one problem. Since the house is only 2 years old, it's not like anything was wrong, but the bathroom fan exhaust was ducting into the soffits, which were already vented, but the duct didn't have its own exhaust vent. As the inspector pointed out, this was not following the rules. We were shocked, so we called the builder who was still in charge of the HOA. The builder told us that this year's building codes changed, so the units were up to code when they were made. I say, okay, I guess I'll add exhaust ports to the soffits to sell the place. "Not yet," says the builder and HOA president. "The HOA rules say that you can't change the outside of the house." "Then I don't know how to sell my house." "Not my problem." "Okay, I'll just get all the residents to vote a rule change." Unfortunately, I didn't actually have the time or inclination to pull that off, so instead I just told the buyer about the situation, and they were actually pretty cool about not worrying about installing an exhaust port. I think their inspector had just been grandstanding to try to prove his worth, insisting that they fix something that wasn't actually a problem. My parents have a vacation home in Florida and have an HOA there. The members of the board are the object of their utter hatred. A few years ago, they made the announcement that everyone was required to get a brand new roof that was the same style as the one they had chosen. In a very astute move, my parents refrained from acting. I honestly don't know the style that they were forced to use, but there was something about it that wasn't good at all. Our neighbor immediately made repairs to their roof, and after that, everything started leaking because the tiles were not suitable for the weather in Florida. The shingles on the majority of people's roofs had broken off at this point, which resulted in a great deal of anger among those individuals who had initially spent money on the roof and then had to spend money on it once more. The rule was never followed by my parents, and as a result of the numerous problems associated with it, the rule is no longer in effect. Not my story, but my dad's. Also, not technically HOA, but I think in the spirit of it. And so on. My father purchased the house in which I was raised when I was 2 years old. It needed a significant amount of work. He most likely spent at least $100,000 to fix it up in total. It is at this point that the story begins to unfold. My father was informed by the city building inspector that he would be required to construct a sidewalk on his property because it was documented that he had spent more than $50,000 on improvements to his property. However, and only in front of his residence, he was going to pay for the experience out of his own pocket. In the event that anyone sustained an injury while walking on the sidewalk, which suddenly began and then abruptly ended, moreover, he would be accountable for that as well. In addition to servicing, a permanent decrease in the value of the property would also result from this, as it would cut approximately 3 feet into the front yard. During the time that this occurred, the city had recently completed a park playground renovation that had cost well over $50,000, and this information was widely known to the public. Additionally, our home was within a reasonable distance of the park, and there were 2 historic trees located within a few feet of the roadway. My father went to the office of the mayor and wrote a letter, and worded the cover letter in such a way that they would have to publicly read the entire letter out loud during a public meeting. The letter essentially instructed them to set an example for others to follow and to install a sidewalk in the park that had recently undergone renovations, which would require them to cut down 2 historic trees. The general populace was incensed. Once that was done, the building inspector basically gave him carte blanche to renovate the house in any way he pleased. One more thing, there's still no sidewalk. Background: we gave our kids a trampoline, jungle gym, play set, and swings for Christmas to get them outside in the summer. A side plane restriction applies to our HOA. Backyard items must be hidden behind the house. Tuck-in won't hide 20% of the neighborhood backyards from the road, so I think the rule is stupid. Original placement was flagged for violating that rule. We fought it and lost. Wife and I decided to move things behind the house to comply while we worked to scrap that rule, elect more lenient board members. We moved an existing shed to the other side of our yards to make room for everything else. We must get 4 neighbors to sign the application and prove we told them our plans. That's what the signature means, not that you like the changes. Karen went crazy and said we wanted to move the shed closer to her yard. Said it wouldn't work, refused to sign the form, and bullied a neighbor into not signing. Luckily, the community is large, so 4 signatures are easy. One poor person was later chastised by Karen for not picking her side. At Covenant's meeting, who showed up? Effing Karen. She goes on a long rant about how moving my shed would be the worst injustice on the earth, and complains about other things on my property, including a screen-in porch built 20 years before I bought the house. I defend said crap, and the committee says they have no questions. I hear Karen ask for my applications as I leave. Technically, it's past the public viewing period, but review away, lady. The next day, my shed application is approved, but I can only keep half of the play equipment due to visual impact on the neighbors. F&B decided to F over my kids when she couldn't get her way regarding the shed. Appeal to the board and write a laundry list of why their restriction violates our architecture guidelines. First, there's no equipment cap. The effing committee said so during Karen's B-Fest, but caved to silence her. My other neighbors are fine with it. Why is Karen McB-Face's opinion supreme? I learned today that I can keep all my play equipment thanks to the board's pragmatic approach to my appeal. F Karen, I'm bound by HOA rules, not your effing opinions. I'll enjoy smiling and waving at your bitter A every time I enter that shed to grab something or my kids play on the equipment. Thank you for subscribing, the likes, and comments. We're very happy to see you all in the comments too. Thanks for your support.